Her daughter-in-law shattered a family heirloom, then sneered, "It was just old junk." Margaret didn't argue. She saved the footage. By the time Kyle noticed the locks had changed, the deed, trust, and will were already rewritten. For years, they treated her like a guest in her own home. Now, she was evicting them, with a signature and a sheriff. They wanted her silence. Instead, she gave them consequences. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The ballroom shimmered in gold and glass, its chandeliers raining light down on sequined gowns and crisp tuxedos. Waiters wove between tables, balancing trays with champagne flutes like glassy wands. Margaret adjusted the clasp of her mother-of-pearl necklace and scanned the crowd for Kyle. Her heels clicked softly across the marble as a hostess guided her toward the seating chart. "Name?" the young woman asked without glancing up. "Margaret L. Whitaker." A pause. Fingernails tapped on the acrylic clipboard. "Your table, 11. Right over there by the silent auction." Margaret followed her gesture. Table 11 was tucked near the far wall, half-shadowed beneath a dusty portrait of a former senator. A potted ficus drooped beside the chair. No centerpiece, no candles, no warmth, just distance. Across the room, table 2 glowed with centerpiece lanterns and laughter. Kyle sat at its heart, one arm draped casually behind Amber's chair. Margaret saw the glint of his wedding band as he raised a glass. She stepped forward, hoping to catch his eye, but he turned, smiling at someone behind him, and clinked glasses with Amber. Amber leaned in to whisper something. The waiter nearest them laughed, then Margaret caught it. "Don't seat her near me." The words landed like frost inside her ears. The waiter nodded discreetly. Amber reached for a shrimp skewer, unbothered, amused. Margaret's face remained composed, her lips drawing upward in an almost convincing smile. She took her seat at table 11 and folded her shawl over her lap. The silverware gleamed. Her water glass remained untouched. The other seats at her table stayed empty, despite the growing noise from across the room. A woman she didn't know eventually sat beside her and began recounting her daughter's divorce to no one in particular. Margaret nodded politely, watching Kyle from a distance. He laughed like he hadn't once begged her to co-sign his grad school loans. His eyes never once scanned the room for her. The wine was poured. Salads were served. A jazz trio played Autumn Leaves with too much reverb. Margaret reached for her fork, missed slightly, then adjusted. Her joints didn't always cooperate the first time. At table 2, Amber leaned her head on Kyle's shoulder and tapped something on her phone. His screen lit up next to hers. A shared chuckle. A secret. Not even a glance toward the woman who'd helped them with their down payment. Margaret stared at the butter knife, resisting the urge to grip it. The speaker took the stage. Polite applause followed. Margaret's own claps were soft, fingers barely brushing palm. Every speech sounded like filler tonight, something said just to be heard, not remembered. Someone toasted to generosity, another to legacy. Margaret raised her glass but didn't drink. Inside her chest, something began to reorder itself. It wasn't rage. She had felt rage before. This was quieter, denser, like a cold current running under the surface, like silt settling after the tide. Her plate was cleared before she'd finished half. She didn't protest. She folded her napkin in thirds and set it by her untouched dessert. Then, as the raffle began and the lights dimmed again, Margaret rose. No one at her table noticed. No one at Kyle's did either. She moved past the banquet table, past the coat check, past the glittering charity signage. Her car keys trembled slightly in her hand, not from weakness, but from clarity. Back home, the air was still and faintly floral from the linen spray she used out of habit. She bypassed the kitchen, the mail, the television. Her bedroom safe was tucked behind an old painting of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She spun the dial slowly, clicked it open. Inside, 2 velvet boxes, her late husband's flag, and the original property deed, untransferred, unforgotten. She laid it on the bed, smoothing the edges with one hand. Across the hallway, the antique clock struck 11. Margaret didn't flinch. She looked down at the paper and let the silence answer a question no one had dared to ask. "They're already practicing for my funeral," she thought, her lips pressed tight. She opened her desk drawer, pulled out a fresh yellow notepad. Then she picked up the phone. "Nadine," she said, her voice calm, "I'd like to revisit the terms of occupancy." The first photo appeared on Margaret's phone while she was boiling water for tea. Amber stood barefoot in the foyer, cradling a white ceramic vase like it was an award. Behind her, the sunlight caught the crown molding and the familiar gleam of Margaret's refinished floors. Caption: Our nest. Finally, home, blessed. Margaret set her phone down on the counter and turned off the burner. She walked into the den, sat at her oak desk, and opened her leather file binder, the one with years of folded notes, watermarked letters, and certified stamps. The original deed was right where she'd placed it the night before, its corners still pressed flat beneath a copy of her late husband's discharge papers. Her name was the only one listed. No transfer, no joint ownership, no recorded change with the county assessor, just Margaret L. Whitaker. She pulled out a pen, circled her signature in steady ink, and breathed in deeply, eyes fixed on the page. They hadn't taken the house. Not yet. The second photo arrived an hour later. Amber posed on the staircase with a throw blanket draped across her shoulders. "First glass of wine in our space," the caption read, with a winking emoji. Margaret's grip on her mug tightened. Her thumb rubbed absent-mindedly at a scar near the handle. She remembered the day she'd dropped that cup while recovering from surgery, the nerve in her hip still raw. That was when they moved in. Not out of charity, out of convenience. Kyle had stood in her hospital room, holding a bouquet he didn't notice her allergic reaction to. "Just a few months, Mom. It'll be easier if we're close by." A few months turned into 8, then the holidays came, then tax season, then Amber claimed she couldn't sleep with all the commute stress. By spring, Margaret's favorite armchair had been replaced with a tufted monstrosity Amber called Statement Vintage. Her framed photographs had been consolidated to one wall. "A memory zone," Amber joked, and her china cabinet, the one with her grandmother's pressed rose porcelain, had been latched shut. When Margaret asked where the key had gone, Amber blinked and said, "Oh, I figured you didn't use it." The third post came after dinner. A photo of the backyard fire pit, logs flickering against the dusk. Amber had captioned it, "When a house becomes a home, in our Whitaker Haven." Margaret sat at the desk again and opened her laptop. She uploaded a scanned copy of the deed to her secure folder. The county site was slow but functional. She navigated to the affidavit form and filled it in line by line, confirming herself as the sole legal owner. Her social security number, parcel number, original purchase date. No transfer of title, no intent to gift or relinquish. She attached the notarized deed scan, verified it twice, and hit submit. Timestamp, 9:42 p.m. Then she opened her email and typed, "To Nadine L. Myers, Eskimo, subject, revocation of informal residency." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't angry. She was resolute. "This isn't eviction," she thought. "This is restoration." She clicked send. From the living room came the sound of Amber laughing through the vents, something high-pitched and breathy. Kyle's voice followed, low, agreeable, barely audible. Margaret stood and moved toward the hallway. She passed the linen closet, then paused outside the guest bedroom. Her guest bedroom now, apparently. The door was ajar. She nudged it open with 2 fingers. Inside, the bedding was changed again, charcoal gray with gold trim. Her floral set was folded in a plastic bin on the floor. On the dresser sat a framed photo of Kyle and Amber in wine country. A reed diffuser masked the old cedar smell. Her bookshelf was gone. Margaret didn't touch anything. She turned quietly and walked back to her room. On her nightstand, her phone vibrated. Another post. Amber. "So thankful to be building our story one day at a time. Just family home, just mine." Margaret stared at it. She tapped the screen once, then opened her notes app and typed a single line. "They don't realize the house is mine. I just let them decorate the waiting room." She turned off the light, eyes wide open in the dark, while outside her bedroom, laughter poured down the hallway like a leaking faucet. And she started counting how many nights it would take to turn their story into her silence. The first box appeared beside her armoire on a Thursday. Plain, unlabeled, its flaps half folded like an invitation or a warning. Inside were a few of her scarves and a stack of hardcovers she hadn't touched in months. No note, no conversation, just a box. Margaret left it there, let it speak for itself. By Sunday there were 4 more, lined along the wall like a silent procession. One of them held her flannel sheets, another contained the hand-painted jewelry dish her sister had made before passing. The boxes didn't smell like cedar or lavender anymore, just cardboard and finality. She stood in her doorway one morning and watched as Amber buzzed past with a roll of painter's tape in one hand and a Pinterest mood board in the other. Margaret caught a glimpse. Pastel swatches, faux marble decals, chrome draw. Handles, the words, Master Ensuite Goals, scrawled across the top in gold marker. I moved a few things to make space for samples, Amber said breezily, peeling tape off the doorframe. Didn't think you'd mind. Margaret blinked once. My linens were in that closet. Oh, yeah, sorry. They're safe in the garage. I labeled everything. Safe. Like evidence. That night, Margaret found her nightstand lamp unplugged, her books relocated to a utility shelf in the laundry nook. The air in her room felt thinner somehow, like the oxygen had been siphoned off by someone else's design choices. Kyle walked in, scratching the back of his head. Amber's nesting. It's a phase. She just wants everything perfect before... He trailed off. Before what? Margaret asked, not turning from the window. He hesitated. You know, just long-term stuff. It's not personal. You still have the guest room. The guest room. A word like a closing door. Margaret nodded slowly, a practiced smile pulling at her cheek. Of course. Everyone deserves a phase. When he left, she walked to the linen closet. The door creaked in protest as she opened it. Empty. Not just her things. Everything gone. The shelves were wiped clean. Even the cedar blocks she had set in the corners were missing. She went back to her own room, what was left of it, and opened the drawer of her old sewing desk. Beneath the bobbins and buttons was a small black nanny cam she'd bought years ago when Danielle used to babysit her beagle. It still worked. She placed it discreetly inside the ceramic planter on her dresser, angled toward the door. By Tuesday, the transition was complete. Margaret now slept in the guest room. Charcoal and gold, cold and silent. Her alarm clock blinked the wrong time. The mattress was too firm, the diffuser too strong. On her old dresser sat a new photo of Kyle and Amber holding paint swatches like trophies. That night, she lay awake and listened. Through the thin walls, laughter trickled in, shrill, smug, familiar. Then the unmistakable chime of FaceTime. Margaret sat up and tapped open the nanny cam app on her phone. The grainy feed stabilized. Amber stood in the doorway of her room, twirling a strand of hair, talking to someone off-screen. No, seriously, it's practically ours anyway. She just hasn't realized it yet. A pause. Amber's laugh echoed through the room like a cracked bell. Margaret hit record. The footage saved automatically. She watched a moment longer. Amber perched on the edge of her bed, Margaret's bed, as if it had been hers all along. The call ended, the light switched off, silence returned, thick and artificial. Margaret tapped through the app and selected Save to Device. Then she attached the file to a fresh email. To Nadine L. Myers, Esquire. Subject, Video Evidence, Bedroom and Residency Misuse Attachment, IMG_5241.move. Her finger hovered over the send button, then pressed it. A breath later, she got up and walked to the garage. The bulb flickered overhead, casting shadows on the stacked boxes, each one labeled in Amber's tidy, patronizing cursive. She found the one marked M's Keepsakes inside. Wrapped in a dish towel was the wooden frame of her wedding photo. It was face down. Margaret turned it over, smoothed the glass with her sleeve, and quietly carried it back inside, past the diffuser, past the fresh coat of eggshell paint, past her sleeping son, into the guest room. She set it on the windowsill. The sky outside was ink black and indifferent. And still, something in her had finally clicked fully into place. Because they hadn't just taken the bedroom, they'd tried to erase the woman who once belonged to it. The scent of rosemary and lemon filled the kitchen. Margaret stirred the pot gently, her rhythm steady, the spoon tapping once every fourth turn. She hummed under her breath, not out of joy but out of muscle memory. Cooking had always been her way of staying rooted. Then the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. A tall man in khakis and a branded vest stood there, clipboard in hand. Behind him, a hatchback idled in the driveway. His smile was professional, eyes already scanning the trim along the roofline. "Good morning. I'm here for the property walkthrough. Shouldn't take long." "Walkthrough?" she repeated, confused but not alarmed. "Not yet." Amber appeared at the top of the stairs, barefoot, phone in one hand, coffee in the other. "Oh, he's with me. I scheduled him for later, but since you're early, we'll just roll with it." She descended the steps like it was her foyer. The man took that as confirmation and stepped inside. Margaret stood her ground. "I didn't schedule any inspection." Amber waved her hand like swatting away a fly. "Just ignore her. She's sweet but forgetful." That word, forgetful. The appraiser's polite smile faltered. "I'm sorry, can I confirm, who is the property owner?" "I am," Margaret said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She walked calmly to the roll-to. P desk in the corner of the room, pulled out a manila folder, and handed the man a copy of the deed with the seal still visible. He studied it, then glanced back toward Amber, who had turned away and was now furiously typing on her phone. "I'll have to reschedule with the listed owner," he said quietly, returning the paper. Margaret nodded. That would be wise. He left in less than a minute, his clipboard tucked tight against his chest. Amber stood frozen for a beat, then exploded. "Do you have any idea what you just sabotaged?" Margaret walked past her, calmly returned to the kitchen, and stirred the sauce without looking up. "Yes." "You're being petty and manipulative," Amber screamed. "This was going to be our upgrade, our future." Margaret set the spoon down. "Funny, you didn't measure my future." Amber stomped out of the room. An hour later, Kyle slammed the garage door behind him, keys jingling like punctuation. He didn't greet his mother. Instead, he walked straight to the kitchen and snapped, "Why do you always have to make everything harder than it needs to be?" Margaret turned slowly from the sink, hands damp, dish towel slung neatly over one shoulder. "Because I was here first." Kyle looked like he'd been slapped. "Amber's trying to make a home. You're acting like a landlord." "I am a landlord," Margaret said, "one who's been treated like a squatter in her own house." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Margaret walked to her phone on the counter and tapped the screen. "Would you like to see what your wife said about me last night on FaceTime? I saved it. For legal reasons." Kyle took a step back. "You're recording us now?" Margaret's voice was calm. "Only when people forget who pays the property taxes." Later that evening, when the house finally went quiet, Amber locked in the bedroom, Kyle pacing outside with earbuds in, Margaret sat at her printer, feeding it screenshot after screenshot. The appraiser's visit, Amber's tantrum in the hallway, Kyle's outburst caught from the edge of the babycam's lens. Each file printed crisp and clear. She labeled each one with a timestamp and clipped them together. Then she slid the folder into an envelope marked Evidence, Temp File A, and placed it beside the phone. She dialed Nadine. The line clicked to life. "You're calling late," the attorney said. "I'm ready," Margaret replied. "Let's move from documentation to declaration." Silence hummed on the other end. Then Nadine's voice, low and deliberate. "Full legal eviction?" "Yes." Quietly, thoroughly, and immediately. Margaret ended the call and walked to her room, what was left of it, and closed the door with the kind of finality that only comes from intention. She didn't lock it. She didn't need to, because they'd tried to sell the walls around her, forgetting the foundation still had her name on it. Margaret stood at the edge of her backyard that morning, robe cinched tight, coffee cooling in her hand. The hydrangeas were blooming unevenly, one side lush, the other strangled by shade. Like the house, she thought. Uneven beauty. Mismanaged roots. Inside, her printer hummed again, one last document spitting out crisp and final. Nadine had called just after dawn. "It's all there," she'd said. "You were smarter than you knew." Margaret had nearly forgotten the trust she and Robert established in 2003. Tucked deep inside, in the third addendum drafted after her second surgery, was a conditional clause. Any cohabitant exhibiting disrespect, emotional neglect, or hostile use of property may be removed at sole discretion of the owner. Not may. Must. Nadine had chuckled dryly. "Looks like we just found our silver bullet." Margaret signed the activation affidavit with an ink pen so old the tip stuttered once. But the signature was firm. She sent it back within the hour. Now, the petition for eviction sat in a manila envelope on her desk, awaiting the sheriff's verification. Margaret had already made the call. Wednesday, 10:15 a.m., quietly, respectfully, legally, permanently. She walked inside, past Amber's shoes by the door, and straight to the hall closet. The small fireproof lockbox sat behind a dusty board game Kyle used to love. Inside was a slim folder labeled Emergency Contacts. Amber's name appeared 3 times: primary, secondary, and travel companion. Margaret pulled the form, crossed Amber's name off each line, and wrote Danielle R. Whitaker in firm cursive print. She faxed the revised pages to her doctor, her insurance provider, and her travel agent. Then she logged into her Medicare portal and submitted the digital update herself. Amber was now emergency contact for nothing, not her health, not her home, not her narrative. Next came the trust. Margaret opened the folder marked Family Beneficiaries, active, and removed Kyle's name, then Amber's. She paused at Kyle's, her pen hovering, fingers briefly faltering, but only briefly. She flipped to a new page. New trustee, Danielle R. Whitaker. Beneficiary, Danielle R. Whitaker. Co-key holder authorization, Danielle R. Whitaker. She texted her niece. "Are you free to meet this afternoon? I need your hands and your signature. No questions yet." Danielle's reply came quick. "Tell me when. I'll bring lunch." Margaret smiled, genuinely for the first time in weeks. By noon, they sat across from each other at the bank. Danielle, fresh out of grad school, looked both nervous and honored. "You're sure?" she asked, pen hovering over the co-key holder form. Margaret nodded. "I'm not just sure. I'm finally awake." They opened a new security box. Danielle's fingerprint was scanned in, her name etched onto the registry card. Inside the box, Margaret placed a copy of the trust, the affidavit of eviction, and a USB drive labeled Whitaker Legal Backup. As they left, the notary called. The will update was ready. All it needed was a signature and a video addendum, standard now for elder-proofing estate declarations. They met in the small private conference room at the law office. Margaret read every word out loud before signing, voice steady, tone crisp. Then Nadine positioned the camera. "State your full name, legal address, and intention," she said gently. Margaret looked directly into the lens. "My name is Margaret Lorraine Whitaker. This is my property, my legacy, and my decision. Let this serve as my formal addendum. Kindness is not inherited. It's earned. I revoke access and claim my space. In full." She signed again. Later that evening, she stood in her closet, her breath shallow, her spine straight. She looked over the now empty space where Kyle's childhood drawings used to hang, where Robert's winter coat once rested, where her own voice used to go unheard. From the living room came the sharp trill of Amber's laughter, followed by a door slamming and Kyle's voice rising, sharp and impatient. Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into the back of her closet and pulled out an old jewelry box. Inside, untouched for years, was her husband's navy compass, still polished, still true. She held it for a moment, then placed it on her nightstand beside the sheriff's notice, ready to be posted in 3 days. Because direction doesn't come from noise, it comes from knowing where you stand. And Margaret had never stood firmer in her life. The sheriff's notice had been posted by noon, taped discreetly behind the side gate, just out of plain view. Margaret didn't want a spectacle, just a timeline, but Amber wanted war, It started with slamming drawers, then louder footsteps, then, without warning, the sharp crack of Margaret's bedroom door flying open so hard it hit the wall behind it. "You think you're clever?" Amber screamed, cheeks blotched red, mascara slightly smeared as if she'd either cried or didn't care enough to fix it. "You blindside me with lawyers? With that pathetic little clause?" Margaret didn't move. She sat at her desk, reading glasses low on her nose, as if she'd been expecting this for months, because in some quiet, measured way, she had. "You feel betrayed?" Margaret said without looking up. "Imagine how it feels to be erased one drawer at a time." Amber stormed in, arms flailing, nearly knocking a porcelain lamp off the dresser. "This isn't how families fix things." Margaret calmly reached for her phone on the desk and tapped the screen. A red light blinked at the top. Recording. "You think that's gonna scare me?" Amber shouted, voice cracking. "You think filming this makes you some kind of martyr? You're just bitter and alone and—" A loud shatter cut her off. Margaret didn't flinch. Amber stood beside the bookshelf, arm outstretched, one of Margaret's heirloom vases in shards at her feet, an ivory piece from the early 60s with a hand-painted rim, a wedding gift, a reminder. Margaret finally stood. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "That vase was a memory. What you just did? That's evidence." Kyle appeared in the hallway like he'd run from the other end of the house, breath shallow, eyes darting. "Jesus, Amber, what are you doing?" he said, grabbing her arm. Amber shook him off. "She's trying to evict us." Kyle turned to Margaret, face pale. "You didn't have to go nuclear. This could have been a conversation." "This was a conversation," Margaret replied. "For months. You just weren't listening." Kyle looked like he'd been slapped. "You're blowing everything up." Margaret blinked. "Number, I'm just putting things back where they belong." Amber laughed bitterly, motioning to the vase. "You're gonna call the cops over a stupid piece of glass? I'm going to file a property damage claim, with time-stamped video." The silence that followed was worse than yelling. Kyle looked down at the broken vase like it had betrayed him, too. From outside, voices filtered in. Neighbors, out walking dogs, or returning from lunch. Two of them, Janice and her husband Greg, paused by the driveway. Greg tilted his head. "You okay in there, Margaret?" he called. Margaret opened the window. Just slightly. "Just documenting a moment," she said. "Appreciate the concern." They nodded. Janice waved. Amber, finally registering the visibility of it all, turned her back to the window. "I want a lawyer," she muttered. "Please do," Margaret replied. "It'll save us time." That night, Margaret filed the damage report with the local precinct. She included a screenshot of the nanny cam footage and the replacement value of the vase, adjusted for inflation. She submitted a copy to Nadine. Subject line, "New documentation, vandalism." Then she changed every lock in the house, the front, the side gate, the garage, the guest room, even the one on the linen closet. A technician came the next morning to install 2 additional indoor cameras, one in the main hallway and one above the mudroom, angled toward the driveway. She paid extra for discreet framing. At the end of the day, she stood at the door, keypad blinking blue, system armed. She was no longer defending her home, she was securing it. As the last bit of daylight faded, Margaret looked at the broken vase, now swept into a Ziploc bag, sealed and labeled with the date. She slipped it into her file box beside the eviction paperwork. Above her, the HVAC hummed, quiet, steady, unbothered. Then, through the vent, came a low, muffled sob. Not Amber's high-pitched tantrum, not Kyle's exhausted sighs, a different kind of sound. The sound of someone finally realizing they'd lost something they never truly owned. Margaret closed the box. Because once you weaponize a home, don't be shocked when it fires back. The waiting room smelled like lemon disinfectant and soft peppermints. Margaret sat in the corner chair, closest to the exit, just in case she needed the reminder that she could leave any time she wanted. She crossed her legs carefully, spine straight, and glanced at the magazine rack. All dog-eared pages and outdated recipes. A nurse called her name, but not like a warning, like a cue. Margaret stood. The cognitive evaluation took just under an hour. Dr. Chan was younger than Margaret expected. Late 30s, calm voice, no visible clock in the room. He asked about memory patterns, decision-making, changes in mood. Margaret answered clearly, with detail and dates. When he asked her to list as many words beginning with F as she could in 60 seconds, she smiled and said, "Do you want the polite ones or the ones I actually thought last week?" He laughed. She didn't. At the end, he pushed his chair back and tapped a form on his tablet. "You're as sharp as they come, Margaret. I'm notarizing the results myself." She nodded once. "Thank you. I just needed it on paper." By noon, Nadine had the scanned affidavit in her inbox. Subject line, Cognitive Fitness Certification, Dr. Michael Chan, MD. Nadine wrote back within the hour. "Perfect. I've added it to both the eviction file and trust archive. Anyone questions your capacity now? We bury them in signatures and state stamps." Margaret brewed herself a cup of tea and stared out at the garden. The hydrangeas still bloomed unevenly, but she noticed a small patch of wild violets near the base of the fence. She hadn't planted them. They'd simply grown where no one told them not to. She opened her laptop. Her Facebook had sat mostly dormant for the past year, only the occasional tagged holiday photo or birthday wish. Today, she wrote something different. Status. For those wondering, I just passed a mental evaluation with flying colors. I'm more lucid than my Wi-Fi. Trust me, the signal is strong. She hit post and closed the screen. Within minutes, the comments rolled in. Elaine Mendoza, Garden Club. "We've always known that, Margaret. Let me know if you want me to testify as a character witness. Ben L. from down the block. Amber couldn't outwit you if she used a cheat sheet. Mrs. Hill from church choir. You always had the sharpest harmonies and the sharpest eyes. Proud of you. The warmth didn't just come from the screen, it came from a truth she no longer needed to argue. Just prove. She was not fragile, she was fortified. The next morning she sat in the courtroom gallery, her hair pinned neatly, her black blouse crisp. Nadine sat beside her with 3 binders and a thumb drive. Amber sat across the aisle, lipstick uneven, eyes smudged at the corners. Kyle fidgeted, folding and unfolding the same court-issued paper. Amber's motion, a hastily filed claim citing mental unfitness and unsafe behavior, was tossed in under 6 minutes. The judge barely blinked. "The affidavit is clear. The evidence is overwhelming. This motion is not only unfounded, it's offensive." Amber opened her mouth, then closed it. Margaret didn't smile. She just reached into her bag, removed a copy of her own countersuit, and handed it quietly to the bailiff. Claim, intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation of character under pretext of incompetence. Amber's jaw twitched. Kyle turned toward Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. Mom, we didn't think you'd actually," he began. Margaret rose to her feet, cutting the air like a clean blade. "I know." She left the courtroom without waiting for a ruling. That part was inevitable. Outside, the air was cool, the sky clean and sharp like freshly washed glass. Margaret adjusted her purse strap and paused on the steps. She hadn't felt this level of clarity in years, and she had no plans to waste it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Danielle. "Just saw the court document. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. Want to get lunch later and celebrate with something sinful?" Margaret typed back. "Make it pie. I've earned layers." She slid the phone away, because next would come the financial strike, and Margaret intended to hit with precision. It started with a declined charge at the florist. Margaret had called to send a bouquet to her friend Linda's rehab center, yellow tulips, nothing fancy, but the card on file had been flagged. "Fraud prevention," the clerk said. "Sorry, Ms. Whitaker, we'll need a new payment method." Margaret hung up gently, then walked into her study. She pulled out her financial folder and opened the credit card portal. The balance was higher than expected, nearly $10,000. She blinked. Her last charge had been 2 weeks ago at the hardware store for new mulch and bird netting, but the statement told a different story. Designer home goods. Boutique purchases from a store called Haven Plus Oak, 4 DoorDash orders from a seafood place she hated, and a $1,599 charge for a vintage velvet chaise from somewhere in Oregon. Her breath stayed even. Her fingers did not. She called the fraud department. The hold music was upbeat, cheerful in a way that felt insulting. A woman named Noreen finally answered. Margaret explained. She answered verification questions. Then she said the phrase she hadn't used in years but always kept tucked away for emergencies. "I believe my daughter-in-law has used my card without consent." Silence on the other end. Then, "Ms. Whitaker, I can confirm several of these purchases are new to your pattern. You're enrolled in transaction surveillance, so the moment you flagged this, a freeze triggered. We'll begin immediate reversal." "Good," Margaret said softly. "I'd like everything Amber Whitaker touched sent back. You'll need to file a fraud affidavit to complete the reversal. I can walk you through it." "I already have one prepared. I'll fax it by end of day." When she hung up, she opened a new file. Fraud, AW, May 2025. She printed screenshots of each charge, underlined the timestamps, and cross-referenced dates with her home security logs. Amber had been home for every delivery. Margaret hadn't signed for a single one. By the time Kyle walked in that evening, Margaret was already organizing return pickups with 3 separate retailers. He came in quiet, hesitant, like a boy who'd broken something in a neighbor's yard. "Mom, Amber told me about the charges. She didn't mean to—" "Stop," Margaret said. "Don't tell me what she meant." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "She didn't think it was a big deal. She thought it was under the shared account. She didn't ask." Margaret said flatly. "Same difference." He opened his mouth to argue, but saw the stack of paperwork spread across the dining table, the return confirmations, the fraud affidavit with its notary seal, the column of itemized charges. "She really messed up," he said, almost under his breath. "She committed a crime," Margaret corrected. "She didn't steal from a stranger. She stole from the person who gave her a roof and forgave her for treating it like a hotel." Kyle exhaled. "Is this it? Is this when you kick her out?" "No," Margaret said, collecting the pages into a folder. "This is when I bar her, legally." She walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the house rule logbook, a dusty ledger she hadn't opened since Robert's passing. She flipped to the back and wrote, "May 13th, AW revoked from property under financial misconduct grounds. Permanent. Irrevocable." She initialed the entry. Kyle's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're not even going to hear her side?" "I've heard it," she said, "in my receipts." He didn't follow her when she left the room. Later that night, Margaret stood by the front door, watching through the sidelight window as a delivery driver loaded the velvet chaise back into his truck. Behind her, the house felt quieter. Not empty, just less invaded. She turned the deadbolt. Then she filed a copy of the police report Nadine had pre-drafted. It didn't accuse. It documented. Just before bed, she got a text from the bank. Refund processed. $9,341.72. Card replaced. File closed. Margaret slid the phone into her nightstand drawer beside the compass and her reading glasses. Because what Amber didn't understand was simple. A home is not a prize, it's a boundary. And Margaret had just redrawn hers in ink. The music started on a Thursday night, low, bass-heavy, pulsing through the vents like a second heartbeat. Margaret was in her upstairs study, sorting through backup trust documents when the first whoop of laughter echoed from the backyard. She moved to the window, pushed the curtain back with 2 fingers, and watched. Amber, wearing a floral robe and holding a wine glass the size of a cereal bowl, was posing beside the fire pit with 2 women Margaret didn't recognize. One of them had kicked off her shoes and was slow dancing barefoot across the patio stones. Another held her phone high, filming. Margaret's floodlights were flicked off. Her "No Guests After 10" rule, written clearly on the HOA community page, was being openly mocked. Amber raised her glass in a sloppy toast. "To our house!" she yelled. Someone responded, "Evict that!" Margaret's hands didn't shake. She simply stepped back from the window, opened the small drawer of her desk, and removed her phone. She opened the security app. The nanny cam picked up motion from the living room. The mudroom feed showed an empty wine bottle rolling lazily near the threshold. She clicked Record All. From a different angle, one of Amber's friends took a selfie on Margaret's porch swing. Margaret opened a fresh document. Subject, nuisance complaint, unauthorized gathering, noise violation, to Maple Glen HOA Board. Date, May 15th. Attached 3 video clips, 1 screenshot. Security log extract. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't editorialize. She let the footage speak. By morning, she had a formal written warning in her inbox. The email ended with, "Please resolve this matter within 7 days or a fine will be issued. We trust your attention to community values." Margaret printed it on heavy cream paper and pinned it to the fridge where Amber would see it. Kyle was still at work when Amber came downstairs in slippers, squinting at the microwave. Her eyes locked on the letter. She read it once, then again. She muttered something under her breath and turned, startled to see Margaret already seated at the table with her tea. Margaret didn't say a word. Amber didn't either. Later that afternoon, Margaret called Danielle. "I need you to hold the wheel for a few days," she said. "You're already my proxy. It's time to test it." Danielle didn't hesitate. "Where are you going?" "Out of range," Margaret said, "and off the record." By Friday, her bag was packed, not with much, just 3 blouses, a pair of sandals, a soft scarf she hadn't worn since Robert passed. She booked a cabin 2 towns over, pet-free, tech-limited, creek-facing, the kind of place where people went to either grieve or reset. She wasn't grieving. She was preparing. Before leaving, she stood by the side window and looked out one last time. Amber was dragging something down the side path, a trash bag or maybe clothing. She shouted into her phone as she went, her tone sharp, posture defensive. The house was starting to feel it, like a body rejecting a transplant. Margaret left a note for Danielle on the kitchen counter. If they call, decline. If they knock, delay. If they threaten, forward to Nadine. She locked the front door behind her, slid the keys into her purse, and didn't look back until she'd pulled onto the main road. That evening, while the sun sank past the hills, she sat on a rocking chair with a cup of cider and her husband's compass in her lap. A moth tapped once at the window screen, then drifted away. Her phone buzzed once, a text from Danielle. HOA called again. Amber tried to claim she was the leaseholder. I forwarded them the deed and the fraud report. Also, her friends came back to party. I filmed it. Want the files? Margaret typed slowly. Not yet. Let her dance one last time. She turned her phone off, because the last piece wasn't noise or evidence, it was absence. And Margaret intended to make them feel every inch of it. It started at 6:07 a.m. sharp. Margaret, sitting in her creekside cabin wrapped in the soft scarf Robert once gave her for Christmas, tapped into her laptop using Danielle's mobile hotspot. The digital dashboard loaded with a hum, her home automation system, linked accounts, and permissions matrix spread out like a chessboard. She began with the Wi-Fi. 1 click. The signal went dark. Then came the utilities. Power? Temporarily transferred to maintenance mode. Gas? Suspended due to suspected unauthorized usage. Water? Meter read scheduled for 72 hours out. Service paused until verified. Digital locks? Factory reset. She removed both Amber and Kyle from every setting. Access groups, code permissions, saved devices. Their phones would now ping "user not recognized" at every entrance. She took a long sip of her coffee and clicked confirm. 3 states away, Amber's world went blank. By 6:13 a.m., the screaming began. It started as a voicemail, then 6 texts in a row, then a FaceTime call, rejected. Danielle forwarded each one in batches with short notes. Amber says the garage won't open. Kyle says their phones aren't connecting to the locks. Wants to know if it's a glitch or a geriatric revenge fantasy. Margaret didn't laugh. She typed a reply. Tell them, you don't have an account. You had an attitude. Then she blocked both numbers. By 8 a.m., Kyle had tracked her to the resort. Margaret watched him pull into the parking lot from behind the Lodge Cafe's glass doors. His car was parked crooked. He was wearing yesterday's shirt. He didn't come in, just called. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She declined. The calls stopped. The cafe barista, a teenager with purple streaks in her hair, brought her a warm scone without asking. "You have the best poker face I've ever seen," the girl said. Margaret smiled softly. "It's not poker. It's planning." That afternoon, the locksmith arrived back home with a clipboard, a security badge, and a county file number. Danielle met him on site. "Keycard resets. Digital code removals. Replace all front locks, garage locks, and backup physical keys, she said, reading off the list. The locksmith nodded. Owner authorization? Danielle handed him a notarized proxy form and a copy of the deed. Direct from the trustee, Margaret L. Whitaker. He got to work. Inside, Amber and Kyle tried to intervene. Amber yelling, Kyle attempting negotiation. But it was too late. You don't live here anymore, Danielle said. You just haven't packed yet. By 4:30 p.m., every lock was new. A moving truck pulled into the driveway at 4:42 p.m. sharp, not one ordered by Kyle or Amber. Margaret had scheduled it from the cabin, through a vetted company that specialized in high-conflict removals. Movers in navy shirts filed in, efficient and silent, labeled boxes marked for storage or disposal. Amber's voice broke through the feed on the mudroom cam, high and panicked. You can't do this. We live here. Danielle stood just off frame, holding the property folder calmly. Number you squatted here. You decorated, you documented, but you never earned it. Kyle tried one last time. Can we just talk to her? Can we ask her? She's not taking calls. At 6 p.m., the movers locked the truck. Margaret watched from her tablet as the sunset painted her front porch in golden streaks. Her email dinged. Subject, service confirmation, mail forward. Complete your request to change mailing address from Whitaker Lane to P.O. Box 3437 has been processed. Every bill, every notice, every legal document, redirected, clean. Margaret set the tablet aside, stood, and walked barefoot across the cold wood floor of the cabin. She opened the screen door, letting the dusk air curl around her arms. From inside came the sound of a final ping, Danielle's last message of the night. It's done. They're out. Your house feels like a house again. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, the breeze kissing her cheek. She closed her eyes for a long moment and whispered, not to anyone, not even herself, just a quiet sentence into the open air. Then she opened her eyes again, because the next chapter wasn't about reclaiming the house. It was about claiming the narrative. The first thing Margaret noticed was the smell. Burnt plastic and synthetic hairspray. A curling iron, cheap, pink, still humming, sat on her vanity, tip scorched and curling the wood beneath it into a warped ripple. A faint black smear spidered along the edge of the counter, creeping toward the mirror like a crack in the truth. She didn't speak. She didn't curse. She just stepped further into the room. Her dresser drawers were open, clothes thrown, hangers twisted like limbs. Someone had smeared lipstick across her mirror. Hope the house loves you back. In the same coral shade Amber had worn to the gala the night they first iced her out. The bed was unmade, not violently, just carelessly. Sheets half torn, comforter dragged, the pillows tossed like afterthoughts. One still had mascara stains pressed into the cotton. Margaret stared at the imprint of someone else's face in her pillow. Then she took 3 photos, wide, mid-range, close. She walked back to the hallway, pressed speed dial, and waited. 911, what's your emergency? No emergency, Margaret said calmly, but I need to report a case of property vandalism, domestic and deliberate. I have evidence and video logs. Is anyone in the home currently threatening you? Number, but they've already threatened the walls. Within an hour, a patrol car sat outside her house. The officer took notes, viewed the time-stamped footage, and confirmed the curling iron burn as documented damage. This could have started a fire, he said, eyes narrowed. Do you want to press charges? Not yet, Margaret replied. But I'd like it on the record. She filed a report under malicious property negligence. The next morning, the HOA delivered its second violation letter, hand-delivered this time, with the kind of thinly veiled exasperation only suburban boards could perfect. Violation, continued nuisance behavior, unauthorized guests, potential safety hazard. Final notice before fines. Danielle scanned it and emailed the PDF directly to Nadine with the subject line, "Your clients just keep digging." Margaret took it a step further. She called her insurance provider, recited her policy number from memory, and requested a solo occupancy endorsement. "I've had multiple unapproved residents removed," she said. "I need a new clause written in. No shared liability. This house is mine. I want the risk profile to reflect that." The underwriter confirmed the update. Premiums adjusted. Coverage solidified. By Thursday, the restraining order paperwork was in motion. Nadine had attached the vandalism report, the HOA warnings, and a formal affidavit from Danielle citing escalating aggression, financial exploitation, and domestic boundary violation. The judge reviewed the file in less than 48 hours. Approved. Amber and Kyle were ordered to remain no less than 100 feet from the property line, with exceptions only for court appearances. The sheriff delivered the order that afternoon. Quietly, cleanly, with an officer stationed in his car for a full hour afterward just in case. Amber's car pulled up 10 minutes later. She didn't get out, just sat behind the wheel, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, staring at the porch like it owed her something. Margaret opened the curtain just enough to meet her gaze. She didn't wave. She didn't blink. Amber reversed down the driveway and didn't return. That evening, Margaret walked back through her room with a lemon-scented cloth and wiped the mirror down in one slow, circular motion. The lipstick smeared, then surrendered. The message disappeared. The glass remained. She stood in front of it and looked at herself fully, wrinkles, spine, silver hairline, and all. Nothing about her looked fragile. Everything about her looked final. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Nadine. Sheriff confirms RO served, HOA satisfied, insurance clause activated. You are, in every legal and structural sense, the sole heartbeat of that house. Margaret replied with a period. Not a question, not an exclamation, just a period, because the sentence was already written. But tomorrow? Tomorrow would begin the headline. It was folded once, plain white printer paper, and slipped through the brass mail slot like any other envelope. No return address, no postmark, just hand-delivered spite. Margaret found it after her morning walk, tucked halfway beneath the corner of her new welcome mat. She didn't open it right away. She carried it into the kitchen, slid on a pair of latex gloves from beneath the sink, and placed the envelope gently atop a manila folder marked Restraining Order Active. Then she unfolded it. 4 words, slanted in rushed script. You should be careful. That was it. No signature, no date, just the implication. She stared at it for a full minute, then laid it flat beside the property damage report and opened her phone. Danielle answered on the second ring. What happened? Envelope, no return, 1 sentence, 4 words. Danielle was already typing. Ring footage? Nothing conclusive. Whoever delivered it wore gloves and a hoodie, kept their head down. Danielle swore under her breath, I'm coming over. That afternoon, a technician arrived with a second-generation ring system and a portable panic button, police-connected, GPS-tracked, monitored 24/7. Margaret watched as Danielle supervised the install. 2 new outdoor cams, a motion-activated doorbell, 1 camera angled straight at the mailbox. Danielle showed her how to arm the system, where to clip the panic button, and how to enable audio recording. If someone sneezes within 50 feet of this house, we'll hear it, she said. Margaret nodded, slipping the small black fob onto the inside of her wrist. She didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she sat in her study with a legal pad and began to log everything. Timestamps of motion alerts, passing vehicles, clicks on her front gate sensor. She even tracked wind gusts and delivery times, cross-referencing ring notifications with her email inbox. She wasn't just protecting her home, she was building a timeline. By the weekend, Nadine had forwarded the note and Margaret's log to the court clerk, along with a handwriting sample from an old thank you card Amber once sent, one with the exact same looping tail on the F and the jagged cross on the T. Preliminary analysis is admissible, Nadine said over the phone. It's circumstantial, but it strengthens your pattern claim. Keep stacking the pattern, Margaret replied. I want to bury them in their own brushstrokes. On Monday, a cruiser rolled slowly down her block. Officer Givens, young, quiet, good at reading people, stepped out. He stood on the porch, not quite entering the property line, and tipped his hat. Ms. Whitaker, we've reviewed the threat note. The handwriting is familiar. We also had a ring alert flagged from a car matching Kyle's make and model. Margaret said nothing, just looked him in the eye. "We've issued a verbal warning to both of them," he continued. "One more incident, and the RO upgrades to a criminal charge. You're not overreacting. You're responding." "Thank you," she said simply. After he left, she stood on her front porch with her arms folded. The breeze caught the hem of her blouse, fluttering it slightly like a flag. That night she drafted a new post, not a legal one, not a report, a message. She opened her Facebook and typed, "I built a life. Then I had to guard it. Threats only work on people who forget they're allowed to be loud. I remember now. Full estate notice coming soon. Transparency is peace." She tagged no one. She included no hashtags. Still, the comments came. "Reverend Maynard, you're an example of courage with paperwork. We're watching. Keep going." A former student from her teaching days, Ms. Whitaker, "I used to think you were too quiet to be strong. I was wrong. You taught me again." And then, beneath it all, one anonymous comment with no photo. "Don't think you've won yet." Margaret screenshotted it, logged the IP source, emailed Nadine. Then she closed the laptop and looked out her window again, ring light pulsing, porch quiet, shadows still. Because they could send paper threats, they could test fences. But Margaret had just made her world traceable, and traceable meant accountable. The reporter's email came just after sunrise, buried between a Walgreens coupon and an HOA newsletter. Subject, profile request, elder care autonomy and legal triumphs. Margaret stared at the screen, her tea steeping beside her in a mug that read, "I am not sweet, I am seasoned." She didn't recognize the name, Natalie Spencer, Metro Profile Weekly, but the request was clear. A story on elder resilience, property rights, and the legal path she'd carved with no backup but paper trails and stubbornness. She didn't answer right away. She let the request sit for 48 hours while she read 3 past profiles, called Nadine for legal clearance, and asked Danielle a single question. "Will they try to twist me into something passive?" Danielle smiled gently. "Only if they underestimate you again." So Margaret agreed. The reporter came with a notepad, a calm voice and wide, curious eyes. She asked about property, identity, memory. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't exaggerate. She just answered. By the end of the interview, Natalie asked if Margaret had any last quote she wanted to include. Something personal. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and looked her straight in the eye. "I wasn't retired," she said. "I was rehearsing." The story published that Sunday under the headline, "The Woman Who Wrote Her Own Return Notice." It was supposed to be a human interest piece. Instead, it caught fire. By Monday, Margaret had over 1,000 new messages in her inbox. A dozen community boards reposted the story. The mayor's office tweeted it, and the dean of the local law school emailed Danielle personally, "Would your aunt be willing to speak on legal literacy and self-advocacy at our next Justice Forum?" Margaret agreed, not out of vanity, but because when you survive a siege, you don't just patch your roof, you hand out blueprints. The auditorium was modest, filled mostly with young women and 2 full rows of senior citizens with notebooks. Margaret stood at the lectern with her glasses balanced halfway down her nose and opened with a single sentence. People love the image of a sweet old woman until she writes her own injunction. Laughter, applause, then quiet. She spoke clearly, factually, about what she'd done, not as revenge, but as reclaiming. She described paperwork as armor, footage as proof, and silence as a tactic of the underestimated. When she finished, a student asked if she ever feared backlash. Margaret answered without blinking, "The only thing I feared was forgetting who I was." That night, back home, she met Danielle in the study. "I want you to have it," she said, sliding over a notarized envelope. "Not just the house, the account, the titles, the archive." The weight. Danielle opened the documents slowly. "Margaret, are you sure?" "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said, "but if I do, I want my exit to echo." They hugged, the kind that doesn't shake or weep, just holds steady, like the passing of a key. Amber's name, once written in ink across multiple pages of Margaret's estate file, now existed only in red strike-throughs and the margins of legal footnotes. Gone. erased not out of rage, but out of accuracy. Later that week, a courier arrived at the door with a flat envelope, linen, cream-colored, embossed with the county seal. Margaret opened it. Inside was a framed letter, restraining order, finalized, permanent, state-endorsed. She hung it in the hallway, not out of pride, not out of warning, but as a quiet museum of what it took to be left alone in peace. That evening, she sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade and watched the wind comb through the yard. A few birds bickered over a feeder. The world, for once, didn't ask her to explain herself. Her phone buzzed with another message. From the reporter, Natalie. "You're trending again. City Council's mentioning elder housing rights now. Want a follow-up?" Margaret smiled, but didn't reply yet. She looked up at the moon rising clean above the trees and whispered, "Let them trend me. I've already set the precedent, because the woman they underestimated hadn't just taken back her house. She'd redrafted the blueprint of who she was allowed to be, and tomorrow, the world would adjust accordingly." Margaret arrived at the courthouse in a navy wool coat, silver hair pinned in its usual twist, and a binder thick enough to anchor a lawsuit on its own. Danielle walked beside her, carrying a slim laptop case and a stainless steel water bottle, her heels clicking with calm. The courtroom smelled like dust and recycled air. Amber was already seated with a thin lawyer whose tie was crooked and face-pinched, like he'd been hired on discount and resentment. Kyle sat behind them, slouched in the second row, his eyes heavy with the weight of consequences too long ignored. Margaret didn't look at either of them. The clerk called the case. Amber versus Whitaker. Civil suit, emotional cruelty, wrongful eviction, elder manipulation. Margaret handed Nadine the flash drive containing ring footage, bank statements, timestamps, and the final HOA violations. Nadine passed them forward without flair. The judge, a woman in her 50s with horn-rimmed glasses and a voice that didn't rise even when issuing warnings, took 10 minutes to scan the folder. 10 minutes was all it took. She closed the file. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. The defendant acted within full legal rights. The plaintiff's claims are both unsubstantiated and, in several places, contradicted by state-verified documents." Amber stood up like she meant to object, but her attorney gently tugged her sleeve, signaling it was over. Margaret remained seated. Kyle rose as they turned to leave. He stopped beside her row, glanced down once. "Mom," he said, barely audible. "I'm sorry, I didn't think it would get like this." Margaret looked up at him, not with rage, not with forgiveness, just clarity. Then she looked past him and said nothing. Outside the courthouse, Danielle wrapped her in a quick, fierce hug. "You handled that like a war general," she whispered. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I'm just someone who got tired of being polite in rooms that were on fire." They walked to the car, sunlight warm on their shoulders, and Margaret's phone buzzed. A donation receipt. "Thank you for your contribution to the Elder Housing Legal Access Initiative. Your gift will directly fund emergency counsel and housing protection for vulnerable seniors in litigation." Margaret smiled. Justice wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who hadn't yet found the words. That afternoon, she updated her voicemail. "You've reached Margaret L. Whitaker. I'm unavailable to the ungrateful. If this is kindness calling, try again. Otherwise, hang up." Danielle laughed when she heard it. "That's the best voicemail in 3 states. Margaret just sipped her tea. Later that week, a parcel arrived, flat, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. She opened it slowly. Inside was a doormat, black rubber border, ivory stitching. It read, "Seat reserved for respect only. No signature, no note, just a silent salute." Margaret set it outside her front door that evening. A light breeze kicked up. A neighbor waved from across the street, and the woman they once whispered about as fragile now walked back into her home without needing to double-lock her past behind her. As she stepped over the mat and closed the door, the security system blinked green. Safe, sealed, final. But before she turned in for the night, she scribbled one last line in her journal beside a date and a checkmark. "Power isn't loud, it's layered, and now I wear everyone." Because next came the finale, and Margaret had no intention of ending it quietly. The valet opened the door with a slight bow, and Margaret stepped out with a grace that belonged to no one but her. She wore midnight blue silk, understated pearls, and heels that didn't hide her age, but announced her endurance. Danielle offered her an arm, more ceremony than support. The ballroom shimmered, not from the chandeliers or the cut glass, but from the undercurrent of recognition. People didn't just look at her now, they saw her. A woman whose name once sat buried in the footer of a guest list now appeared in bold at the top of the evening's program. Honored guest, Margaret L. Whitaker, advocate, educator, survivor. She was led through the crowd like returning royalty, but it wasn't flattery that followed her, it was respect. Danielle paused just inside the doors, leaned close and whispered, "Ready?" Margaret nodded. "Let's take the long way around. Let them see I made it here, walking." As they approached the front table, she saw it. A seat marked with her name in thick calligraphy, a small gold plate resting at the center of the charger. Reserved with honor. She sat, not in the corner, not by the restrooms, not an afterthought. Front row, centered, whole. Amber and Kyle were not in the room, not on the list, not even on the whisper chain. Their names had faded like smudged ink, uninvited, unmissed. Margaret glanced once at the empty seats in the far back, then never again. Dinner passed in courses of polite conversation and quiet nods. People leaned in to thank her, former students, attorneys, a retired librarian who said, "You reminded me I'm allowed to outgrow my silence." When the MC tapped the mic, the room fell into a respectful hush. Tonight, we recognize a woman who didn't just protect her home, she fortified a principle. Margaret stood slowly, glasses in hand, no speech notes, just a memory refined into purpose. She looked across the crowd, into the eyes of women with soft spines turned steel, into the hands of men who no longer mistook poise for permission. "I spent most of my life asking how not to be a burden," she began. "Turns out the real burden was pretending I wasn't already carrying everything." Murmurs rippled. "I am not a martyr. I am not a cautionary tale. I am a woman who had to earn back the right to her own nameplate, louder now, bolder." Ownership isn't just legal, it's personal. It's the right to sit at a table and not wonder if your chair was granted out of guilt. A beat of silence. "I forgive the ones who underestimated me, but I do not return the seat they took." Then, so softly it almost missed the mic, she added, "I reclaimed it. On my terms." The room stood. Applause, not frantic but full. Like rain that didn't rush, just soaked. A woman in the third row with silver curls and a cane folded beside her chair leaned in as Margaret returned to her seat and whispered, "Thank you for not staying quiet." Margaret just placed her hand gently over the woman's and gave it a light squeeze. The evening faded into warmth and conversation, and eventually Margaret and Danielle made their way back to the car. The wind was soft, lifting the ends of Margaret's shawl. Before climbing in, she looked up at the moon, bright and bold, not asking permission to be full. Danielle buckled in and glanced sideways. "You ever think about how it started?" Margaret smirked. "They took my seat once." She paused, then smiled wider. "I took back the whole table.